Alireza Firouzja has been on fire in 2021, and this was one of his finest games. It was played against the Indian Grandmaster Krishnan Sasikiran, and it features an epic queen sack. So this game comes from round 8 of the FIDE Grand Swiss event, and Firouzja was playing white here. We had this standard opening, the Italian game, and after pawn to c3 we had knight f6 and pawn to d3 now protecting e4. Now we had castles from black, castles from white, and pawn to d5 now. The more common way of playing is just with pawn to d6, staying a bit more solid, but you can go with pawn to d5. What you have to be careful of here though after this exchange is that you take care of this e5 pawn, which is now no longer supported in the chain. And that's why after rook e1 we have bishop to g4 now, pinning this knight and thereby defending the pawn in that manner. Knight b to d2 now from Firouzja, and knight back to b6 hitting this bishop. So the move you instantly want to play here as white is bishop to b3, preserving that bishop, but then black can chop the pawn on d3. And in some lines you actually have a lot of play against the queen when it takes here, and often it starts with knight takes on e5, and the idea is that if black takes the queen on d1, then you take this queen on d3 and you're doing quite well. But what black can actually do in this position is just take the knight here with their knight. And now you don't have time to recapture that knight or you lose your queen. And coming back here, you can't take the bishop because the knight recaptures. And we'll see the relevance of that in a moment, because if you imagine this exact same variation but with the bishop on h5, now the white queen can take that bishop and you're doing well. So coming back here, that's why Firouzja didn't drop the bishop back to b3. He instead played pawn to h3, black drops the bishop back, and now he goes bishop to b3. And this position is slightly different because the bishop's on h5. Now if the queen takes, you can take here, and after knight recaptures, it's no longer defending the bishop. So now you can take the bishop on h5 and you're doing well. So the way black often plays in these lines is to drop the queen back to f5. And there's been a few games that have gone down this line. You then have to retreat this knight here, and after something like rook a to d8, white's under quite a lot of pressure and has to tread carefully. So if we run it back a couple of moves, we don't know what Firouzja would have had in mind if black had taken on d3, but we didn't see this in the game. Instead, king h8 was played, not wanting to get into those tactics. And this now releases the f-pawn we note, so we can see the plan that black is trying to go for. Firouzja jumps the knight into e4, he hits this bishop and now defends this d3 pawn, and now black goes slightly wrong with the passive retreating move knight to d7. Better here would have been something like bishop to d6. It looks a bit strange to put it there, but it does do a job of protecting this pawn, and you don't really want to take yet as white, or you activate the queen, and with a rook coming to the d-file, this pawn could be coming under some fire. So coming back here, that would have been a better way to play, but knight d7 was played to protect that bishop, and now we had bishop to d5, exploiting the weakness of the last move because the knight left that square. And this is just a bit uncomfortable. You can't jump this knight away or you lose the pawn here. And once again, probably your best is just to drop the bishop back into d6 or possibly go a5, because in some of these lines, white has very rapid queenside expansion plans, kicking these minor pieces out of the way and then further making e5 weak. So for these reasons, black seeks a different plan and plays pawn to f5 here. Yes, it takes central space, but it does weaken the position now, and white can immediately pounce on this with knight e to g5, looking at these sensitive squares, and black is actually losing in exchange now. So in the game, h6 was played and the knight came to e6, but there wasn't a whole lot better. If you try and play something like queen to e8, well then knight e6 comes anyway, and you're looking at these ones. Say you play something like rook to e8, well now you're running into bishop f7, and there's just a lot of tactical problems basically. So that's why h6 was played instead. The knight jumped in, the queen came to f6, and the knight took on f8. We had rook recaptures, and now a nice break in the centre by Firouzja, pawn to d4. And this took some very careful calculation, because now we know that we're running into pawn to e4, which is what black played. The knight is pinned, so what do you actually do here? And this is where Firouzja goes pawn takes on c5. The knight came into e5, adding more pressure to f3, and now Firouzja unveiled his beautiful idea behind this whole sequence. Knight takes on e5, an epic queen sack, the bishop recaptures, the knight now jumps to d7, forking queen and rook, queen d8, and now Firouzja throws in bishop takes on c6. Just coming to here, you don't want to take on f8 because you diminish some of your advantage, because now we pick up this bishop, we also defend this one, and yes, you're getting a check in, let's say king to g8, knight to f4, queen to d7. You could have something like this, but white just doesn't nearly have all of the same play that he gets in the game. So that's why here Firouzja correctly assesses that he shouldn't take that exchange. He takes on c6 first, black now saves the rook, and Firouzja captures the bishop on d1. Pawn recaptures on c6, now bishop to f4, and queen to h4, so hitting this bishop and leaving this pawn on prise, which Firouzja now takes. But the idea of this is that black wants to get these kingside pawns going and crush the white king with counterplay. So pawn to e3 was played, pawn to f4 could have been tried, but then rook to d4 would have been a decent response. So Firouzja takes this pawn, which is the best move. The rook recaptures, and now rook to d4, hitting the queen and also keeping an eye on this f-pawn break in combination with the bishop. Queen back to e7, bishop to f4 now, the rook slid into e2, and now pawn to b4. And we can see this beautiful pawn chain is now solidified, and this is part of the problem for black as well, that these pawns are going to be rumbling down the board and a passed pawn creation is inevitable. So now queen to e8 from black. Now we had rook to f1, further protecting the f-file and looking at this weak f5 pawn. Queen to e6 now, and rook to f2, trying to trade that active black piece here. The rooks came off. It's difficult to suggest too many moves for black here. King recaptures, and queen takes on a2. So black has won a pawn, but now Firouzja gets his pieces really nicely coordinated. So he doesn't block with the rook, and this is good play because now after queen to c4, things are just getting a tiny bit loose. The bishop is attacked, the pawn is attacked. Yes, you can play bishop to e5 here, but then there's queen h4 check. And this is still winning, but there's just some checks now and it's slightly less coordinated. Instead, Firouzja blocks with the bishop like this, and after the queen moves away, then he plays pawn to c4. And this is the big idea now, that by leaving the rook on d4, you allow this push to c4, and you also protect the base of the chain with this bishop. Pawn to a6 now from black, bishop to f4, queen to e7, and pawn to b5, getting on with the creation of that passed pawn. So the pawns get captured like this, and black doesn't take twice because this one's now storming down the board and can't be stopped. Say something like queen a3, we could have pawn to c7, and queen to c3 comes behind it. It delays queening for a moment, but it's really only a temporary delay. Once we actually coordinate the white pieces, this pawn will be going through. So that's why black doesn't take. Instead, after pawn takes here, they try a queen move again, and now we push on to b6, and we can see this pawn is just rumbling through now and going to decide the game. Queen to b3 here coming behind it, and Firouzja takes a time out with king g1 here, just coming to safety and looking to avoid tactics. Now we had pawn to g5, a last desperate attempt, and here we had bishop to d2, not coming to e5 with the check, because we'll see the idea that Firouzja is setting up with this move. After pawn to g4 here, we had rook to b4, supported by that bishop, and now preparing the advance of this pawn. The queen moved away with check, the king came to h2, and now you don't have time to take here as black, because then we go pawn to b7, and if you take here, we have b8 equals queen, and this is just winning. So that's why in this position after king h2, g3 check was tried, the king captured, f4 check, king h2, and black actually resigned here. If you try pawn to f3, then we can simply play pawn to b7, and white is crashing through. If you enjoyed this video, then do smash that subscribe button to never miss a video, and to see another amazing Firouzja game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.